what we want to do is make the public more rational, more reasonable, more scientific, right? In how they think about the world, how they form their opinions, how they decide what to believe. And you can't really accomplish that goal entirely by giving them facts, right? That's sort of the 30-year-old Carl Sagan, who's awesome, but that was kind of in the 1980s, the prevailing idea was what we call the information deficit model. Right. That people believe pseudoscience, this is what Carl Sagan actually said, this exact quote, people believe pseudoscience in exact proportion to their ignorance of science.
Are you calling Sagan a liar?
Well, that was
it was incomplete.
That was a prevailing idea at the time. It turns out, though, that we've been researching that very question.
John Cook, 2017, right?
It's wrong. That statement by Carl Sagan, we now know, is wrong. In fact, the more science education people have, the more pseudoscience they believe. Right? Until you get to, I'm a working scientist level of science, and then only in your field of expertise, right? So unless you're working and you have an area of expertise where you're a working scientist, there's actually, the more science you know, the more willing you are to actually accept things that the experts would consider pseudoscience, which is paradoxical, right? So something else must be going on. Right, Carrie, you deal a lot with this as well. The science of science communication. How do we actually change minds?
Yeah, and I think that it's really cool to see how much of an increase in those conversations are happening in these academic conferences. And it's really been happening over the last several years. I think that a lot of young scientists, a lot of early career scientists, but even a lot of scientists who have been working for several years are embracing what it means to go out and do SciComm. Because there was a fight. I mean, there's still a fight in some labs, but there was definitely a fight early on for people to have the support of their home institutions to be able to do this. And I think some of you are probably nodding on the inside right now. So whenever I give talks about science communication, I always give kind of like the 5 how-tos, you know, the top 5 SciComm tricks. The first one that I always like to talk about is how important it is to know your audience. This is something very important. This is something we focus on the SGU. Obviously, we've been around a long time. I can't take credit for that because how long have I been with the SGU now?
Since 2015.
Yeah, 4 years.
4 years, 4 years. But they've been doing this for 14, as you said, which is amazing.
So, Kara, you want the audience to fill out like a detailed biography so we can collect that data on them? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's what we need. No, we don't need to know everything about every single person, but it is super important when you're talking about science to understand, are you speaking to a faith community? Are you speaking to a community of children? Are you talking to people who already have buy-in? Are you having to convince them of very simple things before you can get into these deeper things? So number one.
Even on a more general level though, just knowing how human beings operate is critical. Like, know your audience could also mean like what we call the neuropsychological humility model, right? So you can't really change people's minds until you know why they believe what they believe in the first place. And people believe, why do people deny the scientific consensus on global warming? That's a burning question. We really want to know the answer to that question because something like 40% or so of the public, yes, it's definitely a culture. That's also knowing the culture goes along with that as well. Like if you're having this talk in South Korea, it might be a little bit different. But they don't accept the consensus opinion, and we need to know why that is. But more importantly, we want to know, well, how can we bring them over into understanding what the consensus is and accepting the consensus, and just giving them facts doesn't work. In fact, there's something called the backfire effect, which itself is controversial. So this is what's the science and pseudoscience of the backfire effect? So the idea is that if you tell somebody, if I give a global warming denier information about global warming, some studies show that they dig in their heels and they actually increase their denial of global warming. That's the backfire effect. It's not just rejecting the change, it's actually believing the pseudoscience or rejecting the science even more. But that turns out that effect is really hard to replicate. Yeah. Probably because it only occurs with the highest level of emotional and ideological buy-in to the narrative, to what people believe. But for most things, there probably isn't a backfire effect, but there is a resistance to change.
So, I have 4 more. Okay. So the next one is, never underestimate the intelligence of your audience, but always underestimate their vocabulary. And I think that this is something that's really important as somebody who's worked for a very long time in science communication in popular media. I've worked for years on television communicating science, as well as in podcasts on different outlets like National Geographic and CNN and different places. And one thing that I always struggle with in the media landscape is that there's a real underappreciation for how much the public will understand when you share these important stories. And the truth of the matter is, the things that we do in science are not so complex that people can't understand them. But the way we talk about them is like Greek, and so it's very important. And this applies in any field, right? If your plumber is trying to explain to you what's wrong with your toilet, you're just gonna be like mouth breathing, staring at him, because you don't know his lingo. And it's the same thing when a scientist or a physician, right? Physicians are much better at this because they interface with the public quite a lot. This is every day. Number 3, it's not about what to think, it's about how to think, and that really speaks back, goes back to these conversations about neuropsychological humility, about confirmation bias, basically social psychology.
Well, you're throwing a lot of jargon out of there. You want to?
Yeah, these people already know what this means. I think
know your
they do.
audience.
Not necessarily.
I know, but we only have an hour, so I will get to certain things. But let me come back to that. Number 4, be yourself. If you're not genuine, people will immediately disengage. Really does recapitulate some of the points that you were making, is that if somebody doesn't believe that the Earth is older than 6,000 years, you're going to have a hard time communicating certain concepts to them. But if you can find common ground and you can work within their frame of reference, it's going to be much easier for you to be able to have these conversations. And you may not change their mind right away. You may not change their mind at all, but there is a lot of really good social psychology research. There's a whole field. It's called marketing, and we've learned a lot about how to reach people through marketing. It's something that we as scientists, I think, can work a little bit better with those social psychologists and those marketers. And the last one, this is my bonus, and this is probably the most important for most of the people in this room right now, is stop trying to sound so goddamn smart. Because it really, honestly, is not a way to engage with people. It's probably the easiest way to push people away. And it's something that I find every day when I interview scientists that they struggle with. Because the accolades and the jargon are what make me seem official. Right? They're the things that give me weight in my conversation, and they're the things that make it so that I have public trust. But at the same time, they're the things that keep you very, very distant from the people that you're talking to, and they're the things that keep those people from really being able to empathize with you, and vice versa.
Right, so part of what we do is engage with the public on things they're interested in, whether or not it's real or good science, right? So always the classic iconic example of that is Bigfoot, right? And sometimes people call us Bigfoot skeptics, right? Because who cares if Bigfoot obviously is pseudoscience. There's no ape roaming the Northwest. So why even bother examining the evidence and trying to debunk what people are saying? And the point is that if I can explain to somebody how we know that Bigfoot probably doesn't exist, I'm explaining to them pretty much all of science and skepticism and critical thinking, and all the basic principles are there. They're all there.
It really seems old school to talk about.
It does, and we don't talk about it that much, but I mean,
a quarter century ago, but it really is a microcosm for scientific skepticism. It's really all there.
And it is actually relevant still, because we all know who David Attenborough is, I would hope, among this group. Well, look it up online. You can hear him say in interviews, I have no reason.
Who would have thought? No, right, we had actual conversations with actual flat earthers. And so, again, so part of what we do is to try to understand pathological belief, right? And like, I'm a physician, so I like to make a lot of medical analogies. It's like when we see a thing to do is have a better understanding of the more subtle early signs of the disease. It's like people have a hard time understanding the consensus on the safety of GMOs, for example. They get really confused about the implications of that technology.
Steve,
it's all the same thing, really.
Would you say that Deepak Chopra is in the end stage pseudoscience disease?
It is stage 5.
See, maybe we need to look at it like it's actually a disease.
Well, that's one model.
Yeah, we treat people with science.
Yeah, and critical thinking.
Yeah.
Social frame is not going to be effective. And so a big part of the SciComm side of this is understanding a word that may not be popular in a room full of scientists. Constructivism. Ooh, postmodernism. It's such a bad word. But really what it comes down to, that our individual perspective, our individual view of reality is in concert with everybody else's, we're never going to be effective communicators.
That gets to the first find your common ground, right? So like if I'm literally facing off against somebody who whether believes astrology, denies GMOs, or thinks vaccines are horrible, or the earth is flat, the first thing I have to figure out is, where's the common ground? What do they believe in, or what do they not believe in, and why? And maybe they're a conspiracy theorist, for example, and you have to understand conspiracy thinking as a phenomenon, because, yeah, like, flat eartherism is really about the conspiracy, right? The conspiracy is a feature, not a bug, of the reason why they believe in the flat earth. It gets them to a place they want to be. And so if you understand that, then you might understand a little bit more how that could play into more subtle things, and what are the cognitive traps they're falling into. They are, for example, dismissing negative evidence, right, as part of the conspiracy, or any evidence for an alternate theory, well, that's obviously a false flag operation. Yeah. And so they've immunized their position against refutation. And you might think, oh yeah, of course, that's obvious, but I see scientists doing that all the time. Oh, the study of the drug that they thought was going to work was negative. We didn't use a high enough dose. Well, maybe, but you could say that about any study. Oh, the treatment duration wasn't long enough. Okay, maybe this is my favorite. Maybe there's a subgroup in which it works. Right? So these are things that scientists say, and those are what we call arguments from ignorance, right? Or it's just ad hoc reasoning. We're really good at inventing reasons to explain the evidence, or explain or rationalize the evidence. And in fact, and this has been shown too, the smarter you are, the better you are at rationalizing it. So it's actually harder to convince somebody who's really smart and well educated, but who has fallen down a cognitive trap, a conspiracy theory or whatever. It's harder to dig them out of that because, man, they have a lot of shields. They will deflect your evidence expertly, and they know enough to be really dangerous. Right? But then you have to get down to the philosophy of science, and also things like how we construct our image of reality in our memories. It's a constructive process, it's not a passive process. Yeah. So this is where, again, we've thrown out the phrase neuropsychological humility a couple of times. And what that basically means is we all have to understand that as human beings, we are subject to a number of cognitive flaws and biases. We use heuristics in order to have mental shortcuts to understand the world. I teach my students this all the time. When they make a diagnosis that I think is very unlikely.
But heuristics aren't all bad, though.
No, they're a shortcut.
Yeah.
So it's okay as a first approximation, but don't confuse it for reality. So they might think, oh, this patient has all the features of this really rare disease. That's what I think they have. Like, that's the representativeness heuristic. You're confusing how representative it is with the prior probability. And in fact, the fact that it's a rare disease means it's very unlikely to be that. It's actually more likely to be a diagnosis that's not very typical, but is very, very common. That's totally counterintuitive.
Could you classify a human's sense of what their gut is telling them as a heuristic?
Yeah, yes, so that's...
Well, they use heuristics in order to do that.
It's all part of system 2 thinking. So you have the analytical thinking, which is a slow thought process where you analyze evidence and logic. And then there is, this is the thinking fast, thinking slow, Kahneman's book. And then the thinking fast is your gut reaction. How do you feel about it immediately? And those feelings are actually a lot of information. You shouldn't ignore them. But they're rife with biases, right? That's just your immediate bias about something. Or your heuristic that you're not even aware that you're using.
Yeah, those are the things that help us survive.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about is a layer above that helps us use logic and reason.
Right, so science is actually an analytical layer on top of how we understand the world, right? Our intuitions were horrible. We thought the Earth was at the center of the universe, right? And that gases had negative gravity, whatever. All our intuitions were all wrong about thinking about how the universe works. We had to figure it out by system 1 analytical thinking, and science is essentially just a very formalized, institutionalized method of that. And then we try to understand, well, okay, how do we apply that in everyday life? And with the knowledge of how people deceive themselves, right? So when people say things like, I clearly remember this. And of course we all laugh because no, you don't. Nobody clearly remembers anything. You have a constructed memory that has been reconstructed over and over again.
And it's so easy to think that what you see and what you remember is like technology, a recorder, a video camera.
Our brains are not YouTube videos. They're not.
It really is, and I think that's one of the biggest struggles about being a good scientific skeptic is realizing that everything you experience your brain is constructing this reality for you, and it's error prone. Sure, it's accurate enough most of the time, but it fails quite often, and it can fail in very critical times, and that's what you need to appreciate is the self-deceptive nature of how your brain works.
So, Bob, so even when you're experiencing something for the first time, your biases are changing that changing what reality is as your senses get interpreted.
Absolutely.
Right.
And this is what social psychologists and marketers use to their advantage all the time. And this is something that more and more within the science of science communication, we need to co-opt, and we need to understand these shortcomings and use them to our advantage when we're communicating science.
A good example, and don't forget, a lot of times people think that, oh, an expert saw this person is an expert, but there is no expert human. Every human is subject to this. And one great example I've come across was these pilots walking to a plane and they see a UFO. They see this UFO behaving in a way that physics, or modern aircraft should not behave. 90-degree turn, amazing velocities, and they were just entranced by this UFO. And if they had walked onto the plane at that moment, they would have a great UFO story. Like, we saw this UFO one day.
Lots have similar stories.
Yeah.
Same thing.
That's why my next favorite phrase after I clearly remember is, I know what I saw. No, you don't. You don't know what you saw. You really don't. Your brain constructed a first approximation of what it thought it saw, and replete with every bias that you can imagine, and then it immediately becomes a constructed memory, and literally your brain says, oh, I think that might be this, so let me make it look like that, and then that's what you see.
That's a very uncomfortable thought when you start thinking more about that. It's very uncomfortable.
That memory may have, not even close to what really happened. Look at like JFK stories are famous for that.
Oh, and they're totally shaped by cultural expectations. So the stories become way more interesting over time. They, serve the purpose that they originally didn't serve, and they become something very different. I mean, this is how we get false confessions.
Right.
This is how, we have so many phenomena.
Somebody was interviewed after JFK was assassinated in '63. And they have her on tape. They videotaped her describing what she saw. And then 5 years later, as a 50.
Well, her initial testimony was, I didn't see anything. And then you could see, over 30 years.
It morphed into there was a shooter in the grassy knoll. There was an amazing evolution of her memory. And if you asked her, you can't blame her for this. She's not lying. She really believes this. She really remembers.
Bob, she got to the point where she was saying she was running after the shooter.
She was running after the shooter, yeah.
So she went from I saw nothing to I'm literally tapping the guy on the shoulder, running behind him. Yeah,
it's amazing.
All right, I want to ask a quick question because there's a lot of scientists in the audience. How many people here know what the term p-hacking refers to? Raise your hand. Most. That's really good. A few years ago, the answer probably would have been almost none. So that's another example of how this is relevant to like every day and even at the highest levels. If you actually do surveys, 60% of working scientists admit to behaviors that amount to p-hacking, where it's essentially doing questionable research practices that involve things like deciding when to stop collecting data, after you look at the results. You're not supposed to do that.
Changing the hypothesis.
Yeah, going back to, changing the hypothesis is a good one.
That's my favorite.
Or doing 3 different kinds of statistical analysis and choosing the one that looks good, that makes the graph look more compelling.
Does that include cherry picking data?
Yeah, but yes.
That's a little more blatant.
Right, but that's because that's the low-hanging fruit, so to speak.
Right.
But p-hacking is often slightly more subtle than that. I mean, the biggest thing is basically forgetting to do an effect size analysis, or maybe doing one and forgetting that you did it, and then continuing to collect data until you find a significant result, which you should never do. You should know how big your N is in advance.
Right. Or including original observations in your follow-up study. Can't do that either. But the public does p-hacking of reality too, meaning that they kind of cheat in how they evaluate information. When it's not in the context of a scientific study, we call that confirmation bias, right? How many people have heard that term, confirmation bias? Not quite as many, but maybe half. So confirmation bias is what we all do all the time, in that we're overloaded with information, right? Your brain is filtering a ton of information about the world around you. And what we do is, in the background, we are sifting that information, looking for patterns. And we're looking for things that confirm what we already believe, or what we want to believe. Sometimes we kind of grudgingly think that, yeah, this is true, but we want to believe something else. And as soon as we encounter evidence for the thing we want to believe, oh, we readily accept that. We don't challenge it, we incorporate that into our worldview, and we think there's powerful evidence to support my conclusion. But at the same time, we are filtering out all the negative evidence, all the disconfirming evidence. We are rationalizing away things that don't fit our narrative. We are explaining it away. And then at the end, we have what researchers have called, like Dunning-Kruger effect, another thing you may or may not have heard of, a powerful illusion of knowledge, but it's not actual knowledge. And that's what we're confronting. When somebody says, no, GMOs are going to kill you, that's probably somebody who has a powerful illusion that they know what they're talking about. But they don't. And now this Dunning-Kruger effect, how many people have heard of that one? Even fewer.
One of the most cited studies of all time.
That's true, it is. So basically, the idea is they basically tested a bunch of people. They said, here's a test of whatever knowledge. How do you think you did on that test? And how knowledgeable are you in general about this? And then they graphed that against their actual numerical score on the test. And the worse people did, the worse they graded themselves. A lot of people mischaracterized the study, but the difference got bigger. Below the 75th percentile, the worse you did, the more you overestimated your performance. And everybody thought they were above average. So even if you were in the 10th percentile, you thought you were in the 55th percentile, right? Nobody thought they were below 55.
So why is that, and how do we counteract that in ourselves?
So that's the $64,000 question. Dunning wrote a follow-up paper where he said this is the powerful illusion of knowledge thing, but also that they lack the knowledge, the metacognitive ability, the cognitive knowledge and awareness to evaluate their own knowledge and their own competence. And so the more incompetent they are, the more they overestimate their own knowledge or underestimate their own ignorance. And they're also, I think, underestimating the knowledge that exists in that field.
Yeah, because they're not competent enough to know how incompetent they are.
Basically,
that's what it really comes down to.
So, but the thing is, again, initially when you hear about that, like, yeah, other people are dumb, right? You want to think
we all do it.
It's everybody else. It's never me, right?
Fields that we
right
don't
now.
have expertise
Yeah,
in.
we are all on different parts of the Dunning-Kruger curve for different areas of knowledge. This is not about some people. This is about everybody. And so even if you are an expert astrophysicist, when you're talking about geology, you're maybe way down at the bottom of that Dunning-Kruger curve, but you think, I'm a scientist, so I know more than the average person. Maybe you don't, right? So, and in fact, there is what we call the Nobel Prize phenomenon.
Linus Pauling, right?
You know, Linus Pauling, where
Vitamin C.
people basically, because they're an expert in one thing, they way overestimate their knowledge in general. And that sets them up for being cranks, right? Now they believe, like there's the Nobel laureate who's an HIV denier, who thinks that HIV does not cause AIDS. But he's a Nobel laureate. You know, you think, how could somebody like that fall for pseudoscience? Because he's way overestimating his knowledge in a specific area in which he's not an expert.
James Randi did an experiment where he taught two young boys, I don't know, they were probably mid-teens at the time.
In 1920, yeah.
Yep. He taught them to do some magic tricks, and he had
So
them.
Banachek was in
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
Banachek.
Steve Shaw.
So, the quick story is that he had them be tested by they were physicists, correct?
No, they were psychologists.
They were psychologists.
Yeah, Targan Puthoff, and they were these just kids. They said, okay, here, I'm going to 15-minute seminar on how to do magic tricks. They were able to fool these psychologists for months. And they were also instructed to say, if they ever ask you if you're doing magic tricks, say yes.
Yep.
And they were never asked.
So they thought they were psychic?
They thought they were psychic.
Wow.
For months.
And if you see the tricks, you can see this on YouTube.
Yeah.
If you see the tricks they were doing, they were ridiculous.
So we know they're ridiculous.
Yeah, but wait, but even
if you know how they're
where
done, if
you can
know
take
how
a
they're done.
matchbox and you can pinch your skin with it, and if you tighten the skin on your hand, the matchbox will stand up. They bought that trick.
Yeah, but you told them how it was done while you were explaining to them. If you just showed it to them, they would be impressed too. I'm telling you. Or they do the thing where they bend a key with their mind, and it's really impressive until you realize they're just bending the key opportunistically on sleight of hand when they get a chance. And when you know how they do it, every magic trick is ridiculous. When you know how it's done, it's always far simpler than you think it is. In fact, part of the magic trick is convincing the audience that the way they're doing it is really complicated. Because if you think, this is really a high level of skill and complexity, you won't figure out that it's really easy and stupid, right? That's part of the mystique of the magic trick, and that showed you, like, these kids who were given they do this quick, easy magic trick, fooled psychologists, but partly because they wanted to believe in.
Well, but like, let's give magic and people that perform magic some cred. Now,
I'm not saying
first of all,
there's no skill
in
to what
order
they
to
do, there
develop
absolutely
a good trick that can fool people, they have to do a ton of work to get there. Maybe the actual pulling off of the magic trick ends up being something simple, but it takes an enormous amount of effort.
Well, so it's like
even
hacking.
if you go in thinking, all right, this is simple, you still are not going to figure it out most of the time, right? It's still impressive because you can't figure it out.
So it's like hacking, right? It's not all computer code, right? It's some part of it is what we call social engineering. And so magic is the same way. Part of it is sleight of hand, is prestidigitation, is skill, misdirection, all that. Part of it, a lot of it is social engineering. And in fact, there's a good book, Sleight of Mind, where neuroscientists, it essentially worked with magicians to reverse engineer neurologically their magic tricks, because magicians evolved their magic over hundreds of years of trial and error, but they don't know why they work neurologically.
Blind evolution.
And so the neurologists were trying to figure out why they work from a neuroprocessing point of view, and they came up with a lot of really interesting
and it
things.
turns out they said magic is real.
Yeah.
So Steve, one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is confirmation bias.
Yes.
We've been talking about neuropsychological humility, but I think another term that we've all heard before, but that's so important when it comes to communicating science, is cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's this concept or this phenomenon in which it's very, very uncomfortable. It's very hard to be wrong. And when you're faced with disconfirming evidence, it takes people more than one time.
Yeah.
It often can take them years to start to change their mind about things, because if most of the things that you believe are in contradiction with this new piece of evidence, you can't hold on to that cognitive dissonance. It's so psychologically uncomfortable.
You have to care more about the process than whether or not you were right at any particular given time or any particular conclusion. But that's something you have to learn, because we're not born that way.
Right, wired to think that way. No.
All right, we're going to
One quick,
transition.
I have one interesting point. The next time you're cruising social media, could be Facebook, could be Reddit, or whatever.
Cruising, he says.
Yeah. Well, I do that because you're zipping through things, and and what I've noticed, I've tried to observe myself doing it, and particularly late at night, because I don't want to get upset about anything when I'm trying to fall asleep, right? And I know I shouldn't be on my cell phone, but everybody's doing it. So I'm in bed, and anything that comes, if it's a story about people abusing puppies or whatever, I'm like, nope, not dealing with that, and I push past the stuff that I don't want to face. Yeah. But I also do it to science articles that bother me. I like, oh wow, I don't want to read about that. That pisses me off, or it upsets me in some way. And you just zip past it.
Yeah, so
You have to discipline yourself to read the stuff you don't want to read.
Right.
Right.
And you have to put yourself in the headspace of, what if I am wrong?
What participation as well. There is, this is where I do 3 science news items, 2 are real, 1 is fake, although sometimes I do 4 items, which is what I'm doing today. So 3 of these are real, and 1 is fake, and there's a theme. So it's not just random news items. The theme is myths and misconceptions, right? So these are 4 things that that many people believe, which are wrong. Now, 3 of the things that, as I say them, are going to be correct. 1 of the things is going to be incorrect. So I'm going to say one thing, whether I'm correcting a wrong myth or whatever, you'll say.
But wait,
it's
so
like
it could
a double negative in this a little
Yeah,
bit.
whatever. But
the one that's wrong.
One thing is wrong.
The one thing that's wrong, you could have made up out of whole cloth.
Whatever.
Or you've significantly changed the original
there is
information.
something clearly wrong in what I'm saying.
Right.
In one of these 4 statements.
Okay.
Okay, so pay attention. We'll survey the audience really quick, and then we'll see what the experts have to say. And the point of this is how you reason through. There's part of it may just be your fund of knowledge, but really the interesting thing is how do you reason through whether or not you should believe something or not. Okay, so here's item number 1. Isaac Newton was not a true alchemist, as some claim, but was simply pursuing what passed for the science of chemistry of his day. Item number 2, chameleons do not use their color-changing ability for camouflage. Item number 3, most diamonds are not made from compressed coal. And item number 4, despite being called a gas giant, Jupiter is mostly liquid. So I tried to make sure it was different types of sciences, so there may be some experts in the field, but we're just going to do everyone at once, just to get an idea of so which one of those statements do you think is wrong? Is the fiction? And we do this single clap method. So I'm going to say who thinks the one about Newton is wrong, and then we'll do one clap as I bring my hand down. Let's practice. Ready? Great. Okay. So who thinks the statement about Isaac Newton not really being an alchemist is wrong? Okay.
2 people.
Who thinks that the chameleons not using their color changing for camouflage is wrong? Who thinks that most diamonds not being made from compressed coal is wrong? Okay. And who thinks that the gas giant Jupiter being mostly liquid is wrong?
Wow. You guys are so not helpful.
Amazing distribution. That's a great distribution.
And an amazing lack of confidence in the audience.
Yeah.
Those were half claps.
AAAS.
You can barely hear those claps.
All right, can I have this real quick?
Yes.
All right, this first one here about Isaac Newton, but was simply pursuing what passed for the science of chemistry of his day. That one I think is true. I think that Isaac Newton was basically doing what other people were doing when it came to his alchemical aspirations.
Alchemical.
Yes. The second one about chameleons, if they're not changing color to hide themselves, why the hell are they changing color? Right? I mean, it could be for sex. I don't know, but that one I'm not 100% about. Most diamonds are not made from compressed coal. What? How can that possibly not be true? If they're not made of coal, I've been lied to my entire life.
That's the idea. Right?
And the last one here, despite being called a gas giant, it's the only one I had something fairly intelligent to say about. Well, sure. I mean, if a planet that's that big, if there was anything gaseous, it's going to turn that gas into the liquid form of it. So I think that one is definitely science. So I'm going to say it's between 2 and 3. Chameleons, I'm going to say the diamonds one is the fake because I think that you're wrong.
Okay. Good reason.
Isaac Newton not being a true alchemist, as some claim. Yeah, I've heard that claim before, certainly. And didn't modern chemistry, or as we know it today, really start in the 1800s more than Newton's time? So I have a feeling that one's going to wind up being correct. Chameleons not using their color changing ability to camouflage. Would it be for temperature control? They do a lot of those sorts of things happen with these reptiles, having to do with their regulating their thermal capacities. So I think that one's going to be right. Most diamonds not made of compressed coal. I think that one's actually right. You know, coal is grabbed more closer to the surface of the crust of the Earth rather than, but diamonds are way down there. I mean, like many hundreds of kilometers, I thought, is where they're made.
Why didn't you tell me that before the show? How do you know about this?
And the gas. Okay, here's the one about Jupiter that's bothering me. You're comparing mostly liquid, as if you're comparing. How do you compare the gas to liquid and compare those two?
Yeah,
I'm not quite sure.
Volume?
Yeah, what are we talking about here?
What does mostly liquid mean?
So I'll just say that it's the Jupiter one. I think that one's the fiction.
Wow. Crap.
Wow.
Okay, Isaac Newton, not a true alchemist, as some claim, but simply pursuing what passed for the science of alchemy. The way we think of alchemy is what existed after chemistry happened. Before that, everything was alchemy, right? Like, that's kind of like when we talk about phrenology, that it's like, oh, phrenology is pseudoscience. But before we knew Brodmann's areas, phrenology helped us understand a lot of neuroscience. Like, yes, it was disproven, but there were things that came out of it that were important for the day based on what we knew. So I guess I'll go with this one. He was not a true alchemist. He was just a really, really precocious chemist.
So you think that's science?
That's true. Yeah, it's science.
Okay.
Right. Despite being called a gas giant, this is the last one, Jupiter is mostly liquid. Again, I think it has, doesn't it? There's arguments about it having a solid core.
Sure.
It's very convincing. So we think there's some solid, we think there's
Metallic
probably,
hydrogen.
yeah, some liquid, probably some gas. So
It's a hybrid.
mostly, I don't know. Like it might be most, in terms of, what do you call it?
Plasma? No.
Diameter,
Oh, yeah, yeah,
it might be more gas, but in terms of volume or mass, it might be more liquid. So I don't know, I'm gonna go with that. So the two that are bothering me, most diamonds are not made from compressed coal. I mean, diamonds are made of carbon, but why does it have to be coal? Like there's other sources of carbon.
Because in Superman 2, he took.
All right.
We saw him do it.
You can make your dead body into a diamond.
I know.
Did you
Yes,
know?
you
Pretty
can.
cool.
Yeah.
I'm not made of
Wasn't that
coal.
Superman 3?
Okay.
Wait a second.
So chameleons do not use their color changing ability for camouflage is a very blatant statement. You didn't say solely for camouflage.
Not for camouflage.
You didn't
Yep.
like they never use it for camouflage, ever. I mean, of course, they probably don't cognitively know that they're camouflaging themselves, but chameleons do adapt to their surroundings in terms of color. They do not change to a color that's not the color. that
Maybe they're a
on.
living mood ring.
So at some, and even if they were, some aspect of that is camouflage. At
Yeah.
least some. To say that there's no chameleons never, it's called chameleon camouflage. So I don't know. I have to say that one's the fiction.
Get what you want.
All right. What are you gonna say?
And I need this first.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to start from the bottom. Despite being called a gas giant, Jupiter is mostly liquid.
Bob, you should know this.
He always gets so mad.
Bob's the
Planet
astro
ones,
guy.
yeah.
I'm going to have to say that it's a little bit surprising because the outskirts of Jupiter, that's where most of the volume is and the gas is. So I would think that there would be more, at least by volume. But by weight, maybe it would be surprising. So
Well,
I'm
I'd
just
say
gonna-
it's by every measure. It's by weight, by
Okay.
volume, by diameter, by
All
every
right,
measure.
I think that's a little surprising, but
Wow.
I'm not ready to say that that's fiction. The diamonds and coal, sure. I mean, sure, it doesn't need to be coal. But I buy that as well. Chameleons, yeah, and I think Evan might have hit on that one by temperature control. I really don't think that they use it for camouflage. That's a
Ever?
That's a second. That's not what they're thinking. They're not thinking. I
This
need to
doesn't
hide
say it's
myself.
what they're thinking.
No, what I'm saying is that they do it for one reason, and the camouflage is just something that is a byproduct. That is not why they do it. I'm buying that one. The one that I have a
But
problem
I will
with.
endorse Kara's interpretation of that statement, where it's just not for camouflage
Yeah,
at
because
all.
if that was a secondary product, this would be
Right.
wrong.
They are visually blending into their environment, but they're not using it for camouflage.
that
I'm
is the
buying it.
definition
this
of
is saying
camouflage.
They're not visually blending into their environment.
Yeah.
That's what that's
Oh.
saying.
Bob, you're really complicating this.
Yeah.
You just got to
He's
pick
saying
one of
even
them.
if it's secondary,
It's not their
it's
intent.
not-
It's not happening. That's what
It's
that's
just
saying.
never happening.
Put your chip down.
Then those videos and pictures that I've seen are just like made up pseudoscience, fake news. Is that what you're saying? All right. Regardless of any of that, I have a problem with Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was a guy that spent far much more time dealing with alchemy than physics. It's surprising. If you look at here's all of his physics work, and then here's all his alchemical work. It's like amazing. Like, why did you waste all of your time? And sure, early alchemy was related to chemistry, just like early phrenology was related to brain, neuroscience to a certain extent. But I think he was a true alchemist. At least he had to believe that he could turn lead into gold. Isn't that the what's the expression?
Transmutation.
Yeah, the
Yeah, that was the Holy
Right,
Grail.
and that was the biggest thing about being an alchemist, and I think he believed that.
Wait, we
So-
all gave you different
So
answers?
you guys are all
Four
over the
different
place.
answers.
And the
Well done,
audience is all
Steve.
over the place as well.
Gosh.
It's hard, isn't it?
At least I picked the one about diamonds. I don't have a beef with Isaac Newton. Bob wants to kick his ass.
All right.
All right, he was a jerk. I'm just going to lay that down. He was awesome. But if you look how he dealt with people and his friends, he was a bastard. But I still love him. I still
Not part
love
of
him.
the question, but yeah.
Yeah, come on.
I'm going to take these in reverse order.
Oh, no.
It's encouraging.
That's not
Despite, you guys
Not a
are all
good
over the
sign.
place, so I don't have to repoll the audience.
Oh, should we
Yeah.
re-poll?
Do
Good.
it.
All right, very, very quickly. Newton fiction.
Oh, we lost.
Wait, do it again.
We got one.
Two people.
Chameleons fiction. Diamonds fiction. And Jupiter fiction. Okay, not much, but you just the Newton dropped out. All right.
Online people are 1 and 3?
Yeah.
1 and 3.
As a
Okay, so
fiction.
that's
They have
Newton
access to
and
interwebs.
diamonds. Despite being called a gas giant, Jupiter is mostly liquid. Which one of you thought that was in the figure?
I thought that was
That was
fiction.
Evan.
That one is
Say it.
science. That one is absolutely science. By any measure, it is mostly, let me give you some numbers. I got the numbers down here.
Oh, well.
By mass, I'm sure it's probably heavier.
So Jupiter actually has, and we learned a lot from Juno, but there's still a lot more to learn, in fact.
Fundamental stuff like that?
Yes.
No?
Yeah, because
Wow.
you can model it in so many different ways. So the current model of Jupiter is that it really has a thin atmosphere, just 124 kilometers
That's
of
awesome.
gas.
Oh, is that all?
and then 12,000 kilometers of liquid molecular hydrogen, and then 45,000 kilometers of liquid metallic hydrogen.
Wow.
So it's mostly liquid hydrogen. And then beneath that, you have liquid helium, and then you have some kind of core. We're not really
Metallic
sure.
hydrogen, I think.
Yeah,
right?
then,
we don't
then
know yet.
metallic, right? And then you have the rocky core, but we don't know really how big it is. It's got to be some core down there, but we don't know how big.
So Steve, is the red eye of Jupiter the
That's
storm?
gas.
That's gas. That's on
Yeah,
the surface.
That's a storm on in the
Right.
atmosphere. Yeah, it's still a big atmosphere, 124 kilometers, but it's tens of thousands of liquid helium.
Yes.
and
It's
then
just the outer skin of Jupiter, really.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's just the
Cool.
outer skin.
Fascinating.
So a couple other cool facts I came across because of that, because you have liquid hydrogen is conductive, right? It can conduct electricity. So and it's fluid. So you have a fluid
Magnetic
conductive.
field.
That's
That's
why
the magnetic
Jupiter
field.
has a how big is it? How big is it?
Biggest in the solar
It's the
system.
biggest thing in the solar system is Jupiter's magnetic field,
Whoa.
450 million miles.
Wow.
That's
And it
Wait,
generates
bigger than the sun's?
Yeah, it's the biggest thing in the solar system. It generates 10 million
I'm not
amps.
buying that one.
10 million amps of electricity. So if we had a station near Jupiter,
Let's
that
plug
could
into
generate-
that.
plug
Yeah.
into the magnetic
Yep.
field of Jupiter. It's
I read some
tremendous
science
amount of
fiction
energy.
that did that.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah.
All right. Most diamonds are not made from compressed coal. Jay, you had a problem with that one.
I have a big problem with that
Some
one.
people in the audience have a problem with that one. That one is
Say it.
science.
What the hell?
And Evan hit upon it. Most of the diamonds that are mined come from the mantle, come from stable
Volcanoes.
diamond region in the
Volcanoes.
mantle brought up by volcanoes.
Okay.
And that is much deeper than coal.
Wait, what?
Coal is whatever.
So what?
3 kilometers.
So why?
Yeah, a few kilometers, and diamonds are made of about 150 kilometers.
So why is everybody wrong? Like, where's the
it's
misinformation
a
coming
myth
from?
that is just really persistent.
It
I don't think
permeates
I've
the
ever even
culture.
heard
That's
that.
it.
So what's it made out of?
It's made out of carbon.
It's carbon.
Yeah, but not coal.
From volcanoes?
No, volcanoes bring it up. So it's just there's just deep carbon in the mantle,
In what form though? How'd it get there?
and
What's
it
the-
gets compressed.
We're all, I mean, carbon's
Carbon's
a
everywhere.
common element.
Yeah.
It's all
We're
over the
made of
place.
carbon because it's a common element.
I
already.
understand that, but I'm just trying to visualize
you
it. What
go.
does it look like? Where is it?
What does it look
Does
like?
it look like coal maybe?
No. So the other thing is, most diamonds are older than the life that formed coal, right? So most of it's 3 billion years old. And,
Okay.
You know,
And also, how many allotropes of carbon are there?
yeah,
There's a
Yeah.
lot.
it's a lot.
It looks like diamonds, Jay.
I'm still not sold on
It's
this.
totally correct. So it's deeper and older than coal, so it can't be from coal.
All right.
There are 3 other sources of diamonds, by the way, on Earth.
That's right.
So subduction zones produce a little bit of diamonds, very small amount though. Asteroid impacts produce nanodiamonds,
And cubic zirconia.
and some diamonds come from space, like they formed somewhere else and they just
No, diamonds
Isn't
from
there like-
heaven.
And we
Isn't there
make our
something
own.
where it rains diamonds?
maybe.
And we make
Yeah.
our
what
own.
I'm
And we
talking
make our own.
Yeah, I remember some planet rains
Not
diamonds.
including artificial. Okay.
Oh, 10 minutes.
Number 2, chameleons do not use their color changing ability for
Say it.
camouflage.
Say it.
Good luck.
You think that's a fiction?
Yes.
And that one is science. They don't use it at all for
Yeah.
camouflage.
Still don't
So-
buy it.
Awesome.
No, they don't.
Cognitive
They
dissonance.
don't.
What's it about?
Their natural color is camouflaged, but when they change their skin color, it's mood ring. Jay's correct. So they are expressing their emotions, and it's a way of communicating their emotions to other chameleons.
So maybe the
pretty cool.
chameleon goes onto a rock and says, I feel like a rock
No,
right now.
they do not change their color to their surroundings at all.
But how
They're-
have we all
Not
seen
remarkable.
that
There's
happen?
no relationship to the color of their surroundings. It is not at all related. So, recent
I read that.
studies.
I did read that.
So, first of all, there were recent studies where we didn't even really know how they did it.
Yeah.
They have what are called iridophores. Iridophores are like nanocrystals in 2 skin layers, and they change the arrangement relative to each other of the iridophores, and that changes the iridescence, the reflection of light, and that changes the color.
It's the
like
chameleon.
structural color
Yeah.
in butterfly wings.
It's
Yeah,
their
exactly.
version of midi-chlorians.
No, it's not.
say that, but it'd be
Never
wrong.
say that word again. Okay.
Yeah, but it's not for camouflage. So the whole chameleonics thing is a misnomer. It's just they don't use
I
it.
still love that word, though.
Yeah, that's
Of course you
But,
do.
but it's a
That's a good
chemical.
word.
It's a chemical reaction essentially, which is why it's very,
It's a
very
structural
slow.
reaction.
It's a structure.
structural.
So it's not like
Wait.
octopi. Like so, octopuses will.
That's based on their brain. Their brain is like
when they're under
changing.
stress, they tense up, and that changes their skin color, basically. So, like with an octopus, will actually shuttles pigments in and out of their skin cells. Chameleons don't do that. They're just shifting the mirrors in their skin.
Right, but an octopus will do it at the speed of thought, essentially.
Yeah.
This is controlled by their
The chameleons are pretty
nervous
fast, too.
system.
They're
Chameleons are pretty fast. It
It's
just
just
spreads.
as fast
It's
as
slow. It's slow.
maybe it's slower than an octopus.
Much
It's
slower.
not that. All right. Cool. That's
Which
very
means?
cool.
Say
Which
it.
means
Say it.
that
Which means-
Isaac Newton was not a true alchemist, as some claim, but was simply pursuing what passed for the science of chemistry of his day, is the fiction. He absolutely was an alchemist, not just doing chemistry that they called alchemy. He wasn't like an astrologer who was doing real observations of the sky. He was a freaking alchemist. Let me explain to you why I can say that. So, Isaac Newton believed in what was called primal wisdom, right? The idea that when the world was created, and he was a creationist, when the world was created, God imparted this primal wisdom to certain outlets on the world, and his job was to find it, was to find the original understanding of how God made the world.
Okay.
And that was the pursuit of alchemy. He also absolutely believed in the Philosopher's Stone. He was actually pursuing...
You like Harry Potter?
He wanted to create the Philosopher's Stone was believed by alchemists to be the thing that could transmute one substance into another.
Lead to gold.
Lead into gold is the classic, but he thought that if he figured out the primal wisdom of alchemy, he would have total control over nature, right? Not just turning
So he
lead
wanted to
into
be
gold.
Thanos. You're saying he wanted to be
In
Thanos.
fact, you know what one of his names for himself was? Because he had all kinds of secret alchemical names for himself.
Called
Oh my
himself
God.
Infinity Gauntlet?
Jehovah Sanctus Unus,
Whoa.
which was Jehovah the Holy One. Because he
Yes.
thought that he was going to figure out how God's mind worked, and he would have
Self-deification.
power over nature. That was alchemy at its essence, at its core. He was an alchemist. He wasn't just doing chemistry and calling it alchemy. He was an alchemist.
Right.
And the figure that I read was 10% of his writings were on alchemy.
10%.
10%. Which
And he was hitting the head with an apple, and that was the end of that.
But he
Wait a
didn't
second,
publish.
say that again?
He didn't publish.
10%.
10% was a figure that I read recently, but I know I've heard higher numbers.
I've
as
heard
well.
that it dwarfed anything else he
But
did.
he
Well,
was
maybe
also doing like
individually.
biology. He was doing
Yeah.
a lot of anatomy. Like
It was
he,
going to be a plurality of
Ran
what
the
he wrote.
gamut.
But he never published. And in fact, by the time he died, alchemy was already a pseudoscience, right? It was already embarrassing, and so his supporters were happy to sort of bury that as well. So it was kind of like a secret, that Newton was an alchemist. But because there's so many writings, historians have been able to go and go, yeah, look at this. He was writing a ton about alchemy, and he really bought it. So very, very quickly, Newton thought that in order to understand the mind of God, you have physics, math, and alchemy. Like these were the three pillars of his understanding of the world. They were equal pillars. Alchemy was right there, and the supernatural alchemy, not just early chemistry. Very interesting.
Plus he was a bastard.
Plus he was a bastard. Right.
It's more of a bastard.
So that was a pretty good division. And you guys actually scared the audience away from the correct answer.
Great.
Whatever, I'm so happy.
See how bad Bob's science communication is?
Yeah.
Aw, no. Don't forget, these are brothers.
Yeah,
It's
that's
all
true.
with love. They say it with love.
Right. All right,
Right.
Evan, give us a quote. I don't know if we'll have time for any questions, but give us a quote and then we'll
All
close
right.
up the show.
It may be research and it may be important, but unless enough details of the experimental methodology are made available so that it can be subjected to true reproducibility tests by skeptics, it isn't science. Dan Gelseter from the University of Notre Dame, biochemist and molecular biologist.
Good quote. All right. Thank you all for joining us. We got to
Thank you.
go, but we'll be hanging out over here if you have any questions.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.
Bob, can you set the stage back up? There it was.